A calm Denver evening turned into a neighborhood standoff when three strangers in fake security vests blocked the wooden gate of a retired FBI agent. But the man they tried to intimidate was Michael Donovan, a seasoned investigator with steel gray hair and the quiet strength of someone who had faced far darker battles than this on that evening while neighbors prepared dinner and children played under the fading sun. Michael was simply walking his blind German Shepherd Atlas when he found the imposters waiting for him at the end of his driveway. The October air in Denver carried the sharp edge of approaching winter, the kind of cold that slipped under jackets and whispered along the skin. The neighborhood of Pinewood Ridge was nestled against the edge of the foothills, where tall pines clustered like watchmen around streets lined with modest wooden houses. The sky had fallen into that deep cobalt shade that comes just after sunset, when the first stars appeared timidly and porch lights blinked awake across the block. It was here, along Birchwood Lane, that Michael Donovan stepped out of his cedar-framed home, leash in hand, his loyal companion trotting at his side. Michael Donovan was 48 years old, tall and solidly built, his broad shoulders carrying both the calm of a seasoned man and the tension of someone who had seen too much of the world. His hair, once dark brown, had given way to streaks of gray at the temples and crown, lending him the air of a man older in wisdom than in years. His face was angular, marked by faint lines at the brow and mouth, signs of long hours spent under strain, but not without laughter. Tonight he wore a simple outfit, a pale blue button-up shirt rolled at the sleeves, jeans faded at the knees, and a pair of sturdy sneakers. To the casual eye, he was just another middle-aged man walking his dog, but beneath the easy stride was the poise of a former federal agent, someone who had spent decades learning to measure danger in seconds and read lies in the shift of a jawline. His companion was Atlas, a German shepherd now in his twilight years. Once the sharpest dog in his FBI K-9 unit, Atlas had been retired early after losing his sight in a tragic training accident. His cloudy eyes were covered gently with a folded white cloth tied behind his ears, a makeshift blindfold that was more for the comfort of neighbors than for him. Despite his blindness, Atlas moved with eerie confidence, his nose twitching at scents and his ears constantly flicking at the faintest noises. His fur was a mix of black and tan, thick around the neck like a lion's ruff, though streaked now with gray. Though diminished in sight, he had gained something else, an uncanny instinct, the kind of intuition that often startled those around him. Atlas walked beside Michael, not like a dog needing guidance, but like a sentinel guarding his post. The evening was meant to be uneventful, a quiet stroll along the fence line, the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, the faint smell of pine sap on the air. Michael had nothing more pressing on his mind than whether to brew coffee later or leave it for morning. But as he rounded the corner toward the wooden gate that marked the end of his property line, he saw them, three figures standing rigid in the glow of the street lamp. The first to catch his eye was Derek Collins. He was tall, pale, his scalp shaved smooth to a sheen that reflected the amber light above. He wore mirrored sunglasses, absurd at this hour, which obscured his eyes and lent him a vaguely menacing air. His vest, black and tactical in style, bore a cheaply stitched patch that read, "Neighborhood Security Force." To an unsuspecting passerby, Derek might have looked like a law enforcement officer. Yeah, but Michael's trained eye spotted every flaw. The ill-fitting Velcro straps, the scuffed second-hand boots, the posture of a man trying too hard to appear authoritative. His face was a mask of severity, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed insecurity lurking underneath. Derek was the kind of man who mistook volume for strength, who believed intimidation was power. Flanking him were two others. One, shorter and heavyset with a patchy beard, carried himself like a man unsure of his role, his eyes darting nervously around the street as if hoping no one was watching. His vest was a size too small, pinching at the sides, and his hands fidgeted constantly at the hem. The third figure stood slightly behind the pair, a woman with straight auburn hair tied back in a severe knot. She was Linda Clark, the president of the Homeowners Association. In her late 40s, tall and lean, Linda dressed tonight in a tailored gray blazer and pressed slacks, her shoes gleaming unnaturally as though she had polished them just for this confrontation. Her mouth was set in a line of determination, but her eyes burned with a zeal that felt less like civic duty and more like personal vendetta. Michael slowed his steps, Atlas halting in sync, ears pricked forward. He shifted the trash bag he carried in one hand, a routine chore before the walk, and studied the trio. The scene looked staged, too stiff to be coincidence. He had seen this kind of theater before, in far more dangerous places than a Denver suburb. Men who thought costumes could confer legitimacy, that a stitched patch equaled authority. Derek stepped forward, boots scraping the pavement, and lifted his chin. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "Mr. Donovan," he said, "you're in violation of neighborhood regulations. You'll need to come with us." Michael raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching at the corners, almost amused. "Is that right?" he asked evenly. Atlas gave a low growl, deep and resonant, the sound of an old warrior unwilling to yield even to shadows. Inside a modest brick house across the lane, Sarah Miller was setting plates on her kitchen table. Sarah was 35, tall and slender, with a kind of weary elegance that came from years of doing too much with too little. Her long chestnut hair was usually tied back in a messy ponytail, and tonight she wore a simple cardigan over jeans. She had been a single mother since her husband's sudden death in a construction accident 3 years earlier, a tragedy that had left her cautious and protective, yet fiercely resilient. The constant struggle of raising her 8-year-old daughter, Emily, under the watchful and judgmental gaze of the HOA, had made her both defiant and quietly bitter. She smiled easily with neighbors, but held herself back, knowing how quickly gossip traveled in Pinewood Ridge. As she poured milk into a glass for Emily, Sarah noticed movement through the blinds of her kitchen window. 3 figures under the street lamp, confronting Michael. Something about the stiff posture and the absurd vests made her heart jolt. She knew the HOA had been after Michael as well, sending letter after letter. She remembered Linda's words at the last community meeting. "Some people just don't fit into our vision here." Sarah had felt the sting of those words herself. She set the milk down abruptly and stepped onto her small balcony, phone in hand. The cool air bit at her skin, but adrenaline warmed her chest. She hit record, the red light glowing like a witness. Down below, Derek's voice rang sharper. "You can come peacefully, or we can make this difficult. Your property violations and noise disturbances can't go unanswered." Michael dropped the trash bag to the ground, soda cans clattering across the driveway. His stance shifted subtly, weight balanced, hands free. He met Derek's mirrored gaze and spoke softly, almost conversationally. "There is no such thing as the neighborhood security force. You're not law enforcement. You're trespassing." Linda's lips curled, her voice cutting in like a blade. "Don't lecture us about authority, Michael. You've ignored our notices for months. This community has rules, and you are not above them." Atlas stepped forward, his blindfold catching the lamplight, a spectral presence in the night. He let out a deep growl, the sound vibrating through the quiet street. Curtains twitched in nearby houses. A boy's face appeared briefly at a window, phone glowing in his hands. The shadows of the pines loomed behind Michael's house, dark and still, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. 3 imposters at the gate, a retired agent unwilling to bend, a blind dog standing guard, and a single mother on her balcony, camera raised. What had begun as an ordinary evening was tilting towards something neither side could control, and Atlas, though sightless, planted his paws squarely on the pavement, head lowered, growl deepening, as if he could see the truth in ways none of them could. Derek Collins adjusted the cheap Velcro strap of his ill-fitting vest and stepped forward, pulling a crumpled sheet of paper from his chest pocket with exaggerated solemnity. His mirrored sunglasses gleamed absurdly beneath the orange glow of the street lamp, making him look less like a lawman and more like an actor trapped in the wrong play. He cleared his throat, puffing out his chest, and read aloud with a booming voice that carried across Birchwood Lane. "Michael Donovan, you are in violation of neighborhood regulations. Count 1, your wooden fence exceeds the allowable height limit. Count 2, your animal, this dog, creates a disturbance with excessive barking. Count 3, repeated noise complaints regarding gatherings on your property. Count 4, failure to respond to official notices." The list goes on. His pale skin glistened with sweat despite the cold air, and he read the words as though they were scripture, each syllable clipped, rigid, rehearsed. Michael Donovan did not flinch. He stood tall in the cool autumn breeze, the faint sound of dry pine needles rustling overhead, and regarded Derek with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime enduring interrogations more frightening than this performance. His voice, when it came, was quiet but cutting. "That paper has no authority. Neither do you. This isn't law, it's theater." He shifted slightly, his stance balanced, as though anchoring himself to the earth beneath his boots. Atlas, blind eyes shielded beneath his white cloth, stood at his side, a low growl vibrating through his chest like the distant roll of thunder. From across the street, Sarah Miller lifted her phone higher, zooming in on the imposters' faces. The red recording light blinked, broadcasting their clumsy act to anyone willing to watch. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She had felt powerless too many times before under the HOA's gaze. But this moment was different. Her voice was steady when she whispered into the camera microphone. "They're not real police. Look at those vests. Look at the boots. This isn't legal." Her daughter Emily tugged at her cardigan sleeve, wide-eyed, whispering, "Mom, what are they doing to Mr. Donovan?" Sarah placed a reassuring hand on the child's shoulder, but did not lower the phone. Within minutes, the live stream found its way into the churning current of the internet. Notifications popped up on Sarah's screen, lines of text crawling quickly. "This is fake. Call the real cops. Stay strong, he's right. They can't arrest him. Ma'am, keep filming. The world needs to see this." Her viewership number ticked upward, dozens, then hundreds. The quiet Denver street had just been dragged into the public square. Inside the home, 2 doors down, another figure peered through the blinds. Harold Jennings, a man in his late 50s with thinning blonde hair and a soft paunch, was the interim vice president of the HOA board. Unlike Linda Clark, Harold was a timid man, more comfortable with ledgers than confrontations. He wore a sweater vest, spectacles perched on his nose, and his hands shook slightly as he held a cup of tea. Harold muttered under his breath, "This isn't what we signed up for." But he did nothing, torn between loyalty to the HOA and the gnawing sense that things had already gone too far. Derek's shorter accomplice shuffled forward nervously. His name was Mason Hale, mid-30s, with a heavy build and a scruffy beard that did little to disguise the softness in his features. Mason's eyes darted from Michael to the surrounding houses, catching glimpses of curtains twitching, shadows moving, phones raised. He licked his lips and unfolded a pair of shiny handcuffs from his belt. They glinted under the lamplight, cheap steel bought from an online surplus store, but in his hands they were meant to symbolize power. "Let's just cuff him," Mason muttered, though his voice betrayed more hesitation than conviction. The click of metal was enough. Atlas's ears twitched toward the sound, his entire body tense in an instant. Though blind, he stepped forward, placing himself firmly between Michael and Mason, a deep growl swelling from his chest. His lips curled just enough to show teeth, and the sound alone carried more weight than Derek's booming accusations. Mason froze, the handcuffs trembling in his grip. Michael's voice sliced through the silence. "You're making a mistake. Threatening me with unlawful restraint on my own property? That's not a citation. That's a felony. Do you even understand what you're holding?" Derek sneered, but the mask was slipping. He barked louder, desperate to drown out doubt. "You think you're clever, Donovan, but the HOA has the right to enforce standards. You'll comply, or we'll escalate." His words, though sharp, rang hollow under the scrutiny of neighbors now watching openly from their porches. Across the street, Sarah's phone vibrated wildly in her hand as comments flooded in faster than she could read. Some viewers tagged local news stations. Others demanded immediate police response. She caught her own reflection in the screen, determined, unflinching, and realized she was no longer just documenting. She was part of it. Emily leaned against her hip, whispering, "Mom, are we safe?" Sarah pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, her heart tightening. The truth was, she didn't know, but she also knew silence was worse. One porch light flicked on, then another. A neighbor named Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a bun and a house coat wrapped tight around her, stepped out onto her porch, phone raised. Her voice quavered but carried. "Leave him alone! "We see what you're doing." Her husband, tall and wiry with a cane in hand, joined her, his face stern. The tide of spectators was growing, emboldened by Sarah's live stream and Atlas's warning growl. Mason faltered, glancing nervously at Derek. "Maybe we should," he started, but Derek cut him off with a barked order. "Hold your ground." He's bluffing, but even as Derek said it, his eyes flicked uneasily toward the shadows where more phones glowed. Michael took one step forward, his voice calm, but carrying enough steel to freeze the air. "There is no neighborhood security force. What you're doing is fraud, trespass, and attempted unlawful restraint. Every word, every move you make is being recorded. Walk away while you can." Mason's grip on the cuffs slackened. Atlas, sensing the hesitation, gave one last warning growl and then went silent, muscles coiled but ready. The silence was more dangerous than the sound. It left the imposters standing in a spotlight of judgment, with no authority left but the crumbling illusion they clung to. And above them all, Sarah's camera lens caught every detail, the mirrored sunglasses reflecting the lamplight, the trembling hands on cheap steel, the calm defiance of Michael Donovan, and the unwavering stance of a blind shepherd whose sight was gone but whose purpose was clear. The night in Denver thickened as if the cold itself carried weight, settling into the crevices of Pinewood Ridge. Porch lights glowed like lanterns, their halos casting long shadows across driveways, while the forest at the edge of the neighborhood loomed darker still. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine resin, and with every passing moment, the silence of suburbia was fractured by the gathering storm of human voices and camera clicks. Michael Donovan stood rooted on his driveway, the pale blue of his shirt catching the amber glow of the streetlight. His broad frame carried none of the panic the imposters had hoped to stir. Instead, it radiated stillness. His gray-streaked hair reflected the light like burnished steel, his jaw set firm. Atlas, the old German shepherd, leaned forward at his side, chest vibrating with a low growl, blind eyes shielded by the white cloth. It was as though he sensed not just footsteps and sound, but the deceit itself, the way falsehoods carried a frequency sharper than truth. Michael's voice cut through the clamor with surgical precision. "Impersonation is a federal crime. Do you know what happens to men who pretend to be officers? You want to find out in a federal courtroom?" His words rang louder than Derek's accusations, steadier than Mason's trembling bravado. The neighborhood stirred, curtains no longer twitched, they parted fully. Doors opened, people stepped out onto porches, phones raised high. The quiet anonymity of suburban life broke apart, replaced by a collective gaze that burned hotter than any spotlight. Each face reflected curiosity, fear, or indignation, but all of them reflected something else too. Witness. Sarah Miller, still on her balcony with Emily tucked against her side, felt her heart race. Her voice broke free before she had time to stop it. "I know Linda Clark hired you," she shouted across the street, her words piercing through the night. The phone trembled slightly in her hand, broadcasting her accusation. Sarah's chestnut hair clung to her cheeks in the breeze, and her eyes shone, not with fear, but with defiance. She remembered clearly, 3 weeks ago, after a tense HOA meeting, Linda had lingered in the hallway, her voice sharp as broken glass as she told a fellow board member, "I'll handle Michael Donovan." And that woman, too, Sarah had overheard. And now the words spilled from her lips like arrows loosed from a bow. The effect was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Henderson gasped audibly, clutching her husband's arm. Harold Jennings, still half hidden behind his blinds, paled visibly, his teacup rattling in its saucer. He had always known Linda to be strict, but hearing her name tied so nakedly to this charade made his stomach twist. Derek's face hardened, though a flicker of unease darted across his features. "Stay out of this," he barked, pointing a gloved hand towards Sarah, but the attempt at dominance faltered, his voice cracking under the weight of a dozen cameras pointed his way. Emily, clutching Sarah's cardigan, whispered softly, "Mom, everyone heard you?" Sarah kissed the crown of her daughter's head and whispered back, "Good." They needed to. From down the street, a new voice rose, a baritone, tired but steady. It belonged to Daniel Harris, a middle-aged neighbor known more for fixing cars in his driveway than for joining community meetings. Daniel was tall, with a sturdy build and grease-stained hands, his salt and pepper hair perpetually disheveled. He rarely involved himself in disputes, preferring the safety of his garage, but tonight his voice carried with surprising authority. "She's right. We've all seen Linda pushing too far. This isn't enforcement. This is harassment." He stepped forward into the pool of light, arms crossed, phone visible in his grip. His presence emboldened others. Voices began to overlap. A younger woman, college-aged with short blonde hair, Natalie Turner, who rented the small duplex on the corner, called out, "Leave him alone! He hasn't done anything wrong." A retired veteran named Frank Davies, his frame stooped, but his voice still sharp, added from his porch, "I wore a real uniform. I know what fake looks like, and that," he pointed his cane toward Derek and Mason, "is fake." The imposters found themselves surrounded not by compliance, but by defiance. The sound of phones recording was constant now, a clicking chorus. Derek tried to hold his ground, fists clenched at his sides, but the stiff lines of his jaw betrayed cracks forming beneath the surface. Mason shifted uneasily, the handcuff still in his grip but hanging low, as if gravity itself conspired against him. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The crowd carried his words further than volume ever could. "You see," he said, gaze locked on Derek, "it's not me against you anymore. It's you against the truth." Atlas let out a short, sharp bark, sudden and fierce. The sound startled Mason so badly that he stumbled back a step, nearly dropping the cuffs. The blind shepherd stood like a sentinel, body taut, his head angled toward the imposters as though he could pierce them with eyes he no longer had. His bark was echoed by the rising cries of the neighborhood. "Leave him alone!" someone shouted. "We see what's happening!" another called. "You don't belong here!" rang out from multiple porches. The voices fused together, a tide of sound that swept across Birchwood Lane. For once, the neighbors, divided for years by petty disputes over lawns and fences, were united. And at the center stood Michael Donovan, calm as stone, his presence no longer just personal, but symbolic, a pillar around which his community found its voice. Sarah's phone shook as the comments on her live stream exploded. "It's going viral! News outlets are sharing this right now. Stay strong, you're not alone." The glow of her screen lit her face, highlighting both her exhaustion and her resolve. Derek Collins, for the first time since stepping onto Michael's driveway, faltered. His sunglasses, once a shield, now reflected only the rising rebellion in the crowd. He looked less like an enforcer and more like a man cornered by truth he couldn't silence. And in that moment, under the hum of streetlights and the watchful gaze of dozens of witnesses, the battle lines shifted. This was no longer about HOA rules or fabricated citations. It had become a public trial, neighbors versus imposters, truth versus falsehood, with Atlas's growl serving as its gavel. The air in Denver had grown sharp with cold, the kind that carried whispers down the block and made every sound travel further than it should. The voices of neighbors layered over one another, a chorus of disbelief, anger, and solidarity. Porch lights blinked on one after another, illuminating faces that moments ago had hidden in the dark. Birchwood Lane no longer looked like a sleepy neighborhood. It looked like an open-air courtroom, and Michael Donovan stood at its center. He reached into his back pocket slowly, deliberately. His movements carried the precision of a man who had done this countless times before, though never in his own driveway. With a steady hand, he drew out a worn leather wallet, the edges softened with years of use. He flipped it open, the golden badge inside catching the glow of the streetlight. The glint was unmistakable, federal authority, forged not in bravado, but in years of service. His voice rang out firm and unyielding. "My name is Michael Donovan. I am a retired special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and what you are doing here tonight is a serious crime." The words rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Murmurs broke into shouts. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered, "I knew he carried himself different." Derek Collins, the bald ringleader, shifted on his feet. His sunglasses, which once shielded him with a facade of power, now looked ridiculous under the weight of truth. Mason Hale, still clutching the cheap handcuffs, looked down at them as if they burned his palm. His beard bristled as his jaw worked nervously. Atlas stood steadfast at Michael's side, his blind eyes hidden beneath the white cloth, his nose twitching toward Derek and Mason. His growl had ceased, replaced by a stillness that mirrored Michael's, alert, unyielding, protective. Across the street, Sarah Miller tightened her grip on her daughter Emily's hand. The little girl's fingers curled into her mother's, small but fierce. Sarah's live stream continued, her phone held aloft as hearts and comments surged across the screen. Her voice was steadier now as she stepped off her porch, moving closer to Michael's driveway. "If they can do this to Michael, they can do it to any of us," she shouted. Her words rang with raw truth, pulling at every neighbor who had ever received one of Linda Clark's sharp letters or endured her cutting remarks. The Hendersons nodded, their elderly voices rising. "She's right. This isn't just about him." Mr. Henderson leaned on his cane, his frail frame shaking, but his voice resonant. Mrs. Henderson, her bun now loosened by the night's tension, added, "We let her push too long." From further down the street, Daniel Harris, the car mechanic, stepped closer, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag, as if the confrontation were just another job that needed fixing. "If we don't stop this now," he said, "she'll keep doing it. Today, it's Donovan. Tomorrow, it's Sarah. Next week, it's any one of us." His voice, practical and blunt, added fuel to the growing fire. The crowd swelled not in numbers, but in resolve. Their eyes sharpened, their voices grew bolder. Natalie Turner, the college student with short blonde hair, raised her phone higher. "I'm streaming this too. People need to see." More neighbors followed suit, phones glowing like stars in the dark. Derek tried to bark orders, his voice cracking. "Shut those down! None of you have the right." But his words were drowned out by the noise of a neighborhood united. It was then that movement stirred at the far end of Birchwood Lane. A figure emerged from the shadowy curve of the street, heels clacking against the pavement. Linda Clark. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to control. Linda was in her late 50s, tall and lean, her platinum-dyed hair pinned into a tight bun that made her angular features even sharper. She wore a tailored blazer over a cream blouse, her pearl earrings glinting faintly in the lamplight. Her thin lips pressed into a line as she approached, her eyes sweeping across the scene with growing alarm. Linda had spent years building her reputation as the president of the HOA, efficient, ruthless, and, in her view, indispensable. Her father had been a military man, and she had inherited his iron belief in order above all else. But unlike him, her order often took the shape of intimidation. She believed fear was leadership, that compliance equaled community. Tonight, though, that philosophy crumbled beneath the gaze of her neighbors. The reaction was immediate. Fingers pointed, voices rose. "That's her!" one neighbor shouted. "She brought them here." Another voice, sharper still, cut through. "Linda, we know you hired them." Sarah's phone caught every detail. Linda's sudden pallor, the way her eyes darted to Derek and Mason, silently demanding they restore her illusion of control. But Derek's jaw clenched, his confidence drained, while Mason looked as if he might bolt at any second. Emily tugged on Sarah's sleeve, whispering innocently but loud enough to carry, "Mom, is that the mean lady who yells at people?" The neighbors chuckled darkly, their laughter edged with scorn. The spell of authority Linda had woven for years was unraveling thread by thread. Linda raised her chin, her voice sharp as glass. "This is a misunderstanding. These men are here under board authorization." But her words fell flat. The crowd erupted, jeers and accusations flying. "Board authorization isn't the law." "You went too far this time, Linda." Michael didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. His presence alone, badge glinting faintly, made every word he spoke feel like a verdict. "You put this neighborhood at risk," he said evenly. "You endangered lives with your little power play, and you thought no one would hold you accountable." His words hit Linda harder than any shout, because they weren't emotional, they were factual. The crowd's anger sharpened, no longer diffused but focused squarely on her. Someone muttered, "She tried to silence us, but look at her now." Another voice cried, "We're not afraid anymore." Linda's composure faltered just for a moment. Her eyes darted from camera to camera, her face tightening under the scrutiny of the people she once ruled with unchecked authority. The neighborhood had turned. What she saw staring back at her wasn't fear. It was fury. It was judgment. It was truth. And with that, Birchwood Lane no longer belonged to Linda Clark. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the cold Denver night. Red and blue lights soon washed over Birchwood Lane, painting brick homes and wooden fences with a pulsating glow. Neighbors stepped further into the street, their phones still raised, as uniformed officers exited 2 patrol cars, boots crunching against the asphalt. The weight of real authority had arrived, and with it came the end of the imposter's masquerade. Derek Collins stiffened, his bald head glistening under the flashing lights, sunglasses still absurdly perched on his face despite the darkness. Mason Hale, the bearded accomplice, dropped the handcuffs he had been clutching, the metallic clatter echoing like a confession. Both men looked smaller now, stripped of the illusion of power that tactical vests had given them. The first officer to step forward was Sergeant Luis Ramirez, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, with dark hair cropped short and an expression carved from years of steady service. His uniform was immaculate, his belt organized with practiced precision. Ramirez was known among his colleagues for his calm authority, the kind that reassured victims and unsettled offenders. His deep voice carried easily. "Hands where we can see them." Derek hesitated, his pride warring with fear, but the sight of nearly every neighbor filming convinced him. Slowly, he raised his hands. Mason followed, his shoulders slumping. Michael Donovan didn't flinch as the officers approached. Standing tall in his collared shirt, the FBI badge still glinting faintly in his hand, he spoke with the measured tone of a man who had faced situations far more dangerous. "These men attempted unlawful restraint, impersonated officers, and trespassed on my property. I detained them until you arrived." Sergeant Ramirez studied Michael for a long second, then nodded firmly. "Understood. We'll take it from here." He signaled to his partner, Officer Jenna Green, a younger woman in her early 30s with sharp hazel eyes and a quick stride. Green had built her reputation on keen observation, and tonight her gaze swept from the imposters to the furious crowd to Linda Clark, who stood frozen at the end of the block, her pearl earrings trembling against her skin. The moment Officer Green's eyes fixed on Linda, the crowd erupted. "She brought them here! We all saw it!" The accusations rose like a wave, unrelenting. Linda attempted to hold her posture, her blazer clutched tightly around her frame, but her face betrayed her. The pale mask of control had cracked into something raw. Panic. "Ma'am," Officer Green said evenly as she approached, "we'll need you to step aside and answer some questions." Linda's voice broke through the noise, shrill and desperate. "This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting community standards. These men were authorized by the board." Her words were drowned out by neighbors shouting. Mr. Henderson raised his cane, voice trembling but fierce. "Standards don't come with handcuffs, Linda." Sarah, still holding Emily's hand, added, "You tried to scare us all into silence, but tonight we spoke back." The sight of Sarah stepping into the street with her daughter by her side silenced some of the shouting. Sarah's tall, slender frame seemed steadier now than it had in years. Life as a single mother had etched lines of fatigue around her eyes, but tonight those lines softened under the weight of relief. Emily, clutching her mother's hand, whispered shyly, "Mom, everyone's on our side." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, she believed it. Officer Ramirez gave the order, and within minutes Derek and Mason were handcuffed, this time by real officers. Mason didn't resist, his beard damp with sweat, his eyes fixed on the pavement. Derek tried to keep his shoulders square, but when Ramirez read out the charges, impersonation, attempted unlawful restraint, his face flushed crimson with shame. Linda's turn came swiftly. Officer Green's voice was steady but firm. "Mrs. Clark, if you continue to interfere, we will treat this as obstruction. You'll need to provide a statement downtown." Linda's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around at the cameras, the condemning eyes of her neighbors, the people she had ruled with an iron fist. No one defended her. No one spoke her name in loyalty. Her kingdom had collapsed in one night. Michael exhaled quietly, his posture softening at last. He crouched down and placed a hand gently on Atlas's neck. The German shepherd leaned into the touch, his ears twitching, the white cloth over his blind eyes shifting in the breeze. Michael whispered so softly only the dog could hear, "It's over, boy. You did well." Atlas responded with a faint whine and lowered himself onto the driveway, the white scarf rippling like a banner of peace. When the squad cars pulled away, taking Derek, Mason, and Linda with them, Birchwood Lane transformed again. The flashing lights faded, leaving only the glow of porch lamps and the murmur of neighbors. But something fundamental had shifted. Where once silence reigned, voices now mingled warmly. People who had barely nodded at each other in years reached out with handshakes and tentative smiles. Sarah wiped her cheeks, still gripping Emily's hand. A woman named Carol Whitman, plump, kind-eyed, known for baking pies but rarely speaking out, approached her. "You're not alone anymore, Sarah," she said softly. Others echoed it with nods. Sarah pressed her lips together, overwhelmed, and whispered back, "Thank you." Michael stepped onto his porch, turning to address the crowd. His voice carried not with volume, but with gravity. Power isn't about fear. Real strength is about protection, not threats. That's the kind of community worth fighting for. His words settled into the night like stones into soil, firm and unshakable. The crowd slowly dispersed, neighbors lingering to exchange numbers, hugs, even laughter. Children, sensing the tension had broken, darted back onto the sidewalks with bikes and balls, their laughter rising like a hymn. Later, when the street quieted, Michael sat on the porch steps with Atlas lying at his feet. The old dog rested his head against his master's boot, the white scarf glowing faintly under the porch light. The air smelled of pine and faint smoke, but now it carried something else too. Hope. Sarah approached quietly, carrying a wicker basket lined with a cloth. Inside, warm bread still released the faint scent of rosemary and butter. She set it gently on the porch table. Her brown eyes glistened, her voice hushed, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. You didn't just protect me tonight. You saved this whole neighborhood." Michael looked at her, then at Emily, standing shyly behind her mother. A faint smile curved his lips, the kind that reached his tired eyes. "I didn't do it alone. We all found our voices tonight." The laughter of children echoed down the block, mingling with the rustle of trees. Birchwood Lane felt different now, lighter, freer, as though dawn had come early. And in that moment, Michael Donovan, Atlas, Sarah, and the neighbors of Pinewood Ridge understood something simple but profound. Justice had not only been served, it had been reclaimed by the very people who once feared they had none. In the end, what happened on Birchwood Lane was more than a confrontation between neighbors. It was a reminder that real authority is not built on fear, but on truth, courage, and the willingness to protect one another. Some might call it chance that Michael and Atlas stood in the right place at the right time, but those who believe know that nothing happens without the hand of God guiding the moment. When the darkness of intimidation tried to settle over that community, light broke through. It was not only the flashing police lights, but also the light of faith, unity, and justice. God has a way of turning even the ugliest situations into testimonies of hope. And just as Atlas, blind yet steadfast, stood fearlessly for his master, we too are called to walk by faith, not by sight. In our everyday lives, we face smaller battles, fear, doubt, the voices that tell us we are powerless. But just like Michael's neighborhood, we are never truly alone. God watches, God protects, and God lifts up those who refuse to bow to fear. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it, to comment your thoughts, and to subscribe so you never miss another reminder that truth always finds its way. And if you believe, as I do, that God still works miracles in our daily lives, then write amen in the comments as a prayer, as a sign of faith, and as a blessing over this community of listeners. May God bless you, may He protect your home, and may His light always guide your steps.